I also want to begin with some more thank yous. To thank the special events staff, Siobhan, Kelsey, Liz, and Rosario for making us possible, making us look good. And of course, Professor Sarit Katan-Gribitz for her role in managing this event, as well as her participation as the respondent in the first lecture, and Professor Magda Tetter, who invited me, who initiated this whole thing, and of course, the Schvidler Chair and Center for creating this incredibly rich Jewish studies program. I also want to thank Avital Rossman for her work on the PowerPoints. So today we are going to talk about probably the most famous early modern Jewish woman, perhaps the most famous Jewish woman, at least in historical circles, and that is Glikl Bas Yehuda Leib, who was married to Chaim Hamel Segal. He was from the town of Hamel, or Hamun, as the mythological Pied Piper was, and therefore people like to call Glikl von Hamel or Glikl Hamel. Now, this is a picture of a non-direct descendant of Glikl, Bertha Pappenheim, famous in her own right as one of Freud's most famous patients, as a social and Jewish activist in the turn of the 20th century Germany. She wrote one of the first translations of Glikl's memoir, Ethical Will, from Yiddish into German. But she is not Glikl. Around 1910, she dressed up as she thought Glikl would have dressed and had the photographer take her picture, or excuse me, had the artist draw her picture. This is what we have from Glikl. This is an entry in the Hamburg Communal Pinkas record book, written by Glikl in her own hand. And it says, it's written in Yiddish, today, Sunday, the 21st of Tevet, 5457, that's 1697, I, Gliklithin, widow of Reb Chaim Hamel Segal, paid my balance. Thus, I owe nothing more. So here we have Glikl already, as you see, in the public sphere, paying her own taxes. Now, Glikl was born in 1645. She was married to Chaim at the age of 14. They had 14 children, 12 of whom reached majority, which was quite unusual in those days when infant mortality was something like 50%. They were in international trade in pearls and other precious stones, money exchange, textiles, various other products. They were, on the whole, rather successful. After 30 years of marriage, Chaim died. And after 14 years of widowhood, Glikl remarried to Hertz Levy of the city of Metz, whom we'll talk about later. In 1691, a couple of years after Chaim had died, Glikl, being melancholy, not being able to sleep at night, not having any television, Netflix, she decided to write her book. Actually, she called it 7 Little Books, which are something like a cross between a memoir, autobiography, and ethical will. When you read her book, you see that she's very concerned about several things. One of them is money. Another is honor, getting good matches for her family, religion, and honesty, integrity, having a good reputation in business. These are some of the things that she emphasizes in her book. I would like to just review briefly what modern contemporary scholars have had to say about Glikl over the last 25 years. Monika Richards, a German scholar who edited a volume of studies devoted to Glikl. Glikl, an educated, witty, self-confident, and religious woman. Or the famous historian Natalie Zeman Davis, who wrote a book about 3 17th century women, one of whom was Glikl, and then a Protestant and a Catholic. And she said about Glikl, a fiercely independent widow, relying only on God, self-sustaining and steadfast. So both of these scholars emphasize that she was independent and that she was religious. Michael Stanislavski, on the other hand, looks at the book a little differently. This autobiography is essentially a self-justification, an attempt to detail for her children how she spent her whole life dedicated to their father and to them, suffering for their benefit and through them. And finally, Sava Turniansky, who put Glikl scholarship on a completely new plane when in 2006, she published the first complete critical edition of Glikl's original Yiddish work, together with a Hebrew translation with full apparatus. And last year, this was translated into English by Sarah Friedman. And this is really the most authoritative version of Glikl's book that we have. And Sava, who lived with Glikl for many years, and I think regards her as a friend, says about Glikl, in her work, Glikl reveals her warm and sensitive character, combining sharp powers of observation with, at times, biting humor, anger, obstinacy, fierce criticism, and pent-up contempt, as well as the ability to transcend such emotions, to conciliate, yield, and adjust. And what does Moshe Rosman have to say about Glikl's book? Well, I see in this book at least 2 different narratives that are in some ways in conflict with each other. First is what I could call the narrative of prescription. Glikl, the bourgeois, Glikl, the woman of the establishment, Glikl, the conventional, the traditional, Glikl who believes that God is in control of everything and is just, Glikl who believes in the patriarchy, Glikl who believes that the gender boundary is firm and should stay firm, and that the gender hierarchy is justified. Glikl who believes that a mother should give her children unfailing love, unconditional love, etc. So that's the narrative of prescription, what she wants her children to learn from her book, what she wants them to take away, how she wants them to live their lives. But then there is also what I would call the narrative of experience, things that come out in the telling based on her experience, which are almost a counter narrative to the narrative of prescription. Glikl gives us hints that she has doubts about her faith. She is ambivalent about her role as a parent. She shows us that she skipped across the gender boundary many times and even inverted the gender hierarchy. So the 2 narratives are in some conflict with each other. And what I want to do this evening or this afternoon, wherever you are, is talk about the unconventional gender message that comes out of the narrative of experience. And the illustration that you see is a page from the manuscript of Glikl's book, which was copied from Glikl's original manuscript, Glikl's autograph, by one of her sons. We do not have her autograph. This is the closest thing that we have to what she actually wrote. So first, let's talk about the ideal man according to the narrative of prescription. Here she describes the most ideal man she knew, that is her husband, Chaim Hamel Segal, whom she apparently deeply loved and missed terribly after he died. And she holds him up as a model of what a man should be. Chaim never missed his daily study session. He would fast on Torah reading days. He never spared himself and worked hard to provide a good living for his wife and children. A lot could be written about his exceptional love for his wife and children. He was a remarkably good-tempered man, and he never sought any official position. He was the perfect embodiment of a devout Jew. He served God so devotedly, praying with such conviction. How modest and patient was the dear man. He often suffered at the hands of others, accepting it all stoically. So, what is the ideal man? First of all, he's religious, he's pious, he studies, he is a good provider, active economically, he has a responsibility to support his family, he is modest, he is patient, he's not a show-off. And the illustrations that we have here are illustrations of Jews in Germany of the 17th and 18th century. And what is the ideal woman like? So Glikl describes many women in her book as ideal. Here are two examples. The modest Hesela. She had no equal in the world, with the exception of our matriarchs, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. There was no woman like her for religiosity and piety. She was an Eshet Chayil. So what is the ideal woman? She's modest. She is religious. The word that she uses is frumkeit. That is, she observes all of the strictures of Judaism. And she is pious. That is, she has chassidut or chassidus in the sense that she is supererogatory religious. She goes beyond the letter of the law. And she was an Eshet Chayil. This is a term we've seen before in these lectures. An Eshet Chayil is a technical term, refers to a woman who supports her family. In the case of Hesela, it was because her husband was handicapped, he could not work, and she had to support the family. So when necessary, the ideal woman could support her family. Another ideal woman is honest, clever. Her name was Bela. And Bela believed that she had attained the highest degree of happiness. What is the highest degree of happiness according to Glikl's narrative of prescription? She was married to Ber Cohen, a great scholar, a Kohen from a privileged family, prodigiously wealthy, good-hearted, kind to rich and poor alike. They had a very good life together. So the highest degree of happiness a woman can attain is by marrying well, marrying a rich man, a kind man, a charitable man. That is what a woman should aspire to. That is the ideal objective for a woman. Now, when you read men's literature, you find that women are often barely visible, even invisible. You wonder, were there any women around? One of the great virtues of Glikl's book is that we actually see real women. We see women and matchmaking, women and weddings, women going through pregnancy and birth, women in business, women's religious lives, women's marital lives, women traveling, women being sick themselves or taking care of sick people in their family, women's education, and of course, mothering, And we see women in certain physical environments, women in the home, the synagogue, the birthing room, the marketplace, and the inn. But what is most valuable is this. Here is a picture of two German Jewish Jews around 1700. And what we see in Glikl's book that we rarely see in male literature, rabbinic literature, is women and men interacting. What was life like between husband and wife? What was life like between merchant and customer? What was life like between neighbors of both genders? So Glikl gives us insight into relations between women and men, both on the intimate level and on the larger level, on the communal level. Now, I want to start talking about Glikl's narrative of experience. And through the course of the book, she makes some rather startling observations that border on cynicism and go against, I think, the narrative of description, where we have a harmonious community. Whenever an opportunity arises for a person to utterly ruin another, it is seized gleefully. This obviously comes from her experience in business. If somebody can ruin somebody else, they'll do it. We human beings understand nothing of each other's sorrow. Everyone thinks his own sorrow is the greatest. So that's just an example of Glikl going off of the bourgeois, traditional, conventional ethos and giving us a candid assessment of something that she has observed. Likewise, Glikl shows us in her narrative of experience a different take on what it means to be a woman. In the morning blessings in the traditional Jewish liturgy, famously, there's a blessing that males say, which is, "Thank you, God, for not making me a woman. Shelo asani isha." And there's a blessing parallel to that that women are supposed to say, "Thanking God, asani kirtzono, who made me according to his will." With these two blessings juxtaposed, the women's blessing seems like resignation. Well, okay, I'm a woman, I have to accept it. Well, Glikl takes this blessing and she does something else with it. When she begins telling the story of her life, she starts with this. "I thank and praise my creator that he created me as he desired and saw fit." She's proud to be a woman. And what kind of woman? "My father provided an education in the ways of heaven as well as in the ways of the world to both his sons and his daughters. I'm as good as my brothers. I'm as good as any man. I'm just as educated." What was stereotypically missing from Jewish women was formal education. And Glikl is saying, I have that education. I can hold my own. In Yiddish, there's an expression, Weiberische Sache, women's affairs, women's business. It's like when I was young, before our consciousness was raised, we would say, oh, that's for girls. Anything that is directed at women or has to do with women, that's of secondary importance or no importance. In her narrative of experience, Glikl emphasizes that women's lives matter. What women do does have importance, does have significance. So for example, I gave birth every 2 years and worked very hard, as is the way of anyone with a household with children. So parallel to her saying that Chaim worked hard, she worked hard too. And of course, like many, many women, she worked a double shift because she took care of the household and she also was in the business. Or she says at one point, from this we see that what women desire is not pure stupidity, as many, perhaps some men, would claim. Or Bela, whom we met before, Bela knew how to guide the heart of her husband. So here we see already the idea of gender hierarchy inversion, that the woman can be the one who sets policy, who makes decisions. There is a remarkable passage in Glikl's book when they were on their way from her daughter's wedding in Kleve. She was with her husband, Chaim, and at one point they had to take a coach, and Chaim made sure that Glikl and her maidservant dressed in very poor, ugly clothes so as to camouflage them, so they wouldn't attract attention. And their friend, who was seeing them off, said the following to Chaim: "My dear Reb Chaim, why are you so worried? Why are you making your wife dress so hideously?" My husband answered, "God knows I'm not worried about myself or the money I'm carrying. It's the women folk I'm worried about, my wife and the maidservant." Meir said, "No need to worry. Seriously, Reb Chaim, you're wrong about your wife. You could not have made her dress so hideously. No one would have harmed her anyway." My husband was very angry at Reb Meir's joking and took it very much to heart. And that's all she says about it. As I understand this passage, objectification is the men's problem. That's between the men. She couldn't care less what Meir thinks about her looks. This is something that her husband was offended by, not she. She doesn't say a word about it. She doesn't give it any dignity. And Glikl shows that women have agency. Women make decisions. Women make things happen. So for example, my mother had some business with an advocate, a lawyer, who lived in the horse market. So her mother went to the lawyer to take care of something. Or after the terrible tragedy in the synagogue of Hamburg on Shavuot, when 6 women were killed and many were injured, righteous women established a Psalms recital society, hiring 10 scholars to go to the synagogue every day at 9 a.m. to say Tehillim and study. Of course, it wasn't the women who studied every day. That we saw last week. It took about 4 centuries to develop, but the women took the initiative and had the money to pay scholars to go and study. The widow Breinele was a most devout, wise woman. She did all she could to help us continue on our journey. That journey where Meir implied that Glikl was ugly, they ran into some problems. And it was difficult to arrange transportation. This Breinele, a woman, was the one who was able to arrange things for them. Now, it's well established that in the early modern period, and not only in the early modern period, women who have the greatest degree of autonomy, women who are most free, women who are most their own masters, are affluent widows. They've already been married, so they fulfilled that social obligation, and they have enough money to be independent. And Glikl implies the question, do women really need men once they have their children? So she names a few widows who consciously decided not to get married. My sister-in-law, Jente, remained a widow for several years, unwilling to remarry since she was a young, energetic woman. Because she was young, she didn't want to get married. She wanted to be independent. Or then there's Glikl's own mother. When my father died, my mother was 44 years old. She had opportunities for many good matches and could have remarried and had great wealth once again. But she never wanted that, preferring instead to remain a widow. If God punishes a woman and she loses her first husband, may the good Lord also give her this thought. My mother remained in her dignified widowhood. And then, of course, there was Glikl herself. After Chaim died, and she was admittedly lonely, she still decided not to remarry. Many matches had indeed been proposed to me, the most prestigious in all Ashkenaz. But as long as I thought I could manage to live on the little that my husband left me, I never even considered changing my status. So for 14 years, Glikl remained a widow. After 14 years, her son-in-law in Metz, in Lorraine in France, wrote to her and said that the richest Jew in Lorraine, Hertz Levy, or Serf Levy, was recently widowed and he's looking for a wife. How about it? So Glikl says she decided this would be her ticket to a comfortable old age. She wouldn't have to run around from fair to fair, from city to city, getting up early, staying up late, handling with everybody. She could relax and be supported in the style to which she would like to become accustomed. And she says it would also be good for her children because Hertz Levy's numerous business connections would inevitably help them make good business deals. So, sight unseen, she agreed. And her son-in-law negotiated the Tnaim, the conditions of the marriage, which were largely financial. So Glikl went to Metz to finally first meet and then marry Hertz Levy. And she tells us that when she got to Metz, right before Shabbat, and she arrives on Friday, right before Shabbat, my husband's valet came in with the maidservant, bearing two big gold-plated trays, one with the fanciest desserts, the other with the choicest fruits. Lying on top was a gold chain with a gold bar and two large gold-plated goblets filled with wine. This was my Sabbath fruit. It was exquisite. So this was very impressive. On the other hand, throughout the last parts of her book, Glikl says that from the beginning, she was having misgivings about this marriage. The only reason she went through with it was because her children recommended Hertz Levy so highly, and she made inquiries. He was so wealthy and honest, and she decided she would marry him. Unfortunately, not too long after they married, Hertz Levy went bankrupt. He was left with nothing. And Glikl had given him her money to invest. And he lost not only his money, but her money as well. She was left with virtually nothing. In addition, his son, Samuel, was involved in a big financial scandal and was imprisoned, and the entire Levy family's name was disgraced. So Glikl says, but oh dear Lord and Maker, that gold chain turned literally into shackles and bands of iron. And she says she made a terrible mistake. She should never have married again. What she should have done was to find a good match for her youngest daughter, Miriam, and then go to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, and live as a pious woman, live the life of prayer and contemplation, as that being the peak experience for a Jew. And so she says, but instead of that, what happened? I had to fall into the hands of a man. Now, throughout her book, there are various villains in the story. And it turns out that all of these villains happen to be men. And I'll give you just a few examples. Reb Moshe Helmstedt was a pompous, obese, stuffed, arrogant, wicked man. He would have 10 to 12,000 Reichsdaler of hours on hand, never worrying about the money not belonging, not being his own, or having to return it. He wanted to enjoy it while it was there, buying a fancy carriage and the best horses. He kept 2 or 3 servants. He lived like a prince. The pompous fool, once he got his hands on good Reb Chaim Hamel's money, her husband's money, her money, could not control himself any longer. He arrived in Berlin, started rattling the money. His creditors, Jews and non-Jews, heard of this and had Reb Moshe arrested. Or another villain. Glikl sent one of her sons to study in a yeshiva in the city of Lisa or Lechno. And she received a letter from him that the town of Lechno was extorting money, or was planning to extort money from the parents of students who had sent their sons to study in the yeshiva there. And they would not let them go home unless they paid a certain amount of money. And so he asked her to send money in advance to pay off someone so that he could get out before it was too late. It turned out that his teacher had sent that letter in an attempt to defraud Glikl and get money from her in addition to whatever money she paid for tuition. And this is what Glikl's son said. My teacher must have written that letter in order to get money. He took all my belongings, cut the silver buttons off my coat, and pawned it. When I asked him to return my things, he accused me of spending it all to satisfy my greedy, sweet tooth. And I said I had pawned it all for myself. Thanks be to God that I got away from that scoundrel, since he taught me nothing anyway. And our third example, one of Glikl's sons, Leib, was a total failure in business. He opened up a textile store and went bankrupt. While he was on his way to bankruptcy, and Glikl was assuming that everything was okay, one of Glikl's friends informed her, a man friend, of the dire situation. And this is what the friend told her. Reb Wolf comes to the store every single day and takes what your son Leib sees and what he does not see. Leib also has business dealings with Poles, that is Jewish Poles. And I happen to know that he lost more than 4,000 Reichsdaler in a short time doing business with them. Well, Glikl tells us, I nearly dropped dead. I fainted dead away then and there. So we have male villains, also her unsuccessful son. These are men. Who are the heroes in the book? Well, of course, her husband, Chaim, is a hero, and she has good things to say about some men. But the two biggest heroes of the book are women. The first is her father's stepdaughter. Her father had been married before he married her mother. And his first wife had a daughter. This stepdaughter of her father studied French, played the piano, the clavichord. Glykl's father, among other things, lent out money. And two Christian men had borrowed money from him and left a very expensive pawn with him. They came to the house ostensibly to pay him back and get their pawn back. To entertain them while they were waiting for Glykl's father to bring the pawn, the stepdaughter was playing the clavichord. And here's what happened. She heard the two men speaking in French. When the Jew comes back with our pledge, we'll grab it without giving him the money and get out of here. So when Glykl's father came with the pledge to give to them, she sang in Hebrew, "Beware, not the pledge, today, here, tomorrow, gone." And her stepfather realized what was going on. And the two criminals said, "We've been duped. The whore knows French." And they ran away. The next day, one of them came back with the money and got his pawn. An even bigger hero is Rebecca, the detective of Hamburg. A money changer, a Jewish money changer in Hamburg, in the market of Hamburg, went missing. He was missing for 3 years, and there were all sorts of rumors about what could have happened to him. And then 3 years later, another money changer went missing. And this woman named Rebecca, her husband named Lipman, was also a money changer. And he said, there was a woman going around the market collaring various money changers, asking if they had 600 or 700 Reichsthaler in cash, which is a lot of money. And if they did, they should go with her because she had somebody with gold who would sell it to them. I'll bet that the missing man went with her. And he described the woman. And several people knew who this woman was, including Rebecca. And Rebecca was sure that this woman, who was the servant of the son of a certain tavern owner, that he brought both of these men, both of the Jewish money changers, to the tavern, and they were killed there. But how to prove it? And remember that it was very dangerous for a Jew to accuse a non-Jew of murder. If it was true, the murderer would be punished. But if it were false, the Jews would be punished. There would be a riot. One Shabbat morning, Rebecca was looking out the window early in the morning, and she saw the son of the tavern keeper with his wife carrying a chest. She was sure that the dead body, one of the dead bodies, was in that chest, and she followed them. They went from Hamburg to Altona, which was right next to it. And she went to the mayor of Altona and made her accusation. The mayor made them open the chest. No body, only clothes. And the Jews were afraid. But on her way back to Hamburg, as luck would have it, she ran into the woman who had enticed these money changers. And she said to her, in the best law and order tradition, "Oh, your master and his wife have been arrested. They confessed to everything. So tell me the whole story, and I'll see to it that the three of you can escape, because the Jewish community were only interested in knowing that the man was dead, seeing the body so that his wife will not be an aguna, a chained woman who can't remarry because we don't know what happened to her husband. So just tell me exactly what happened and you'll be free. So the woman told her the whole story, told her where the body was buried, and her master confessed, or excuse me, didn't confess. They went to the tavern and dug up the body. Then they questioned the master about the second missing person. He finally admitted that he had killed him as well and told where the body was buried. So thanks to Rebecca, both of the bodies were found. The murderer was punished. Another woman with a super heroic achievement. And of course, the biggest hero of the book is Glikl herself. First of all, in her relationship with Chaim, on the one hand, she praises Chaim, but there are subtle hints that Chaim wasn't perhaps as successful as she makes him out to be in the way she describes him to her children. She also makes it very clear that she was Chaim's full partner. So when Chaim was on his deathbed and was asked, don't you want to make a will? Don't you want to give instructions? So Glikl says, Chaim said, no, I don't have to make a will. My wife, she knows everything. She should continue just as she was doing before. Or in another place, before he died, Glikl says, it is not to praise myself that I mention that he took advice from no one but me and did nothing until we had talked it over. So Chaim made no important decisions without Glikl's input. I said to my husband, we can try it for 1 year. I will draft a short agreement and see how it suits you. This referred to a partnership. So it's Glikl who convinces him to go into the partnership, and it's Glikl who will draw up the agreement. And on another occasion, when things didn't go well for Chaim in a business deal, he tried to keep it from her. Though my husband did not want to tell me, he could not keep it from me. So here we see already at least a hint of gender hierarchy inversion. It seems that Glikl is trying to say that the real boss here was she. Or another example, once when Glikl and Chaim and some of their children were visiting his parents in Hamel, Chaim was called away. Glikl had to return to Hamburg with the children, and she needed a male chaperone. And this was a Mr. Yaakov. Well, it turned out Yaakov was an alcoholic. And shortly after the journey started, he made a detour to a tavern, and she didn't see him again for the rest of the day till she got to the inn where they were going to stay the night. And she sent 2 villagers to look for him. They found him, with travel and drunkenness, his money all gone. So the villagers brought him to the inn. Despite being furious with him, I thank God upon seeing him again. It cost me more than 7 Reichstaler. I gave him something to eat. So my fine servant, who was supposed to be taking care of me and my children, I wound up taking care of him instead. So it's Glikl who is in charge, Glikl who is competent, Glikl who really doesn't need this man. And then there is Glikl, the businesswoman. In the background is the market in Hamburg. I was doing a brisk business in the fabric trade, selling 500 or 600 Reichsdollars worth of goods a month. I attended the Braunschweig fair twice a year, making several thousand at every fair. My fabric business was doing very well indeed. I imported merchandise from Holland and purchased a large quantity of merchandise in Hamburg too, and I sold it. I had my own fabric store, winter and summer. I traveled constantly on the go. In addition, I dealt in ounce pearls, which I would buy from the Jews. Then I would sort them and resell them wherever I knew there was a demand. I had an extended line of credit if I wanted to make 20,000 Reichstaler Banco during a single Bourse session, I could do it. So Glikl is a big success. So how do I assess Glikl? She's not a misanthrope. She certainly is not a misogynist, but she's not a feminist. She doesn't advocate anything. She doesn't say, as Leah Horvitz, our subject last week, said, society has to change. No, she is happy to keep things the way they are. So she's not a feminist. I would call her a phylogynist. What is a phylogynist? Phylogeny is a way of venerating the embodiment of human attributes identifiable as feminine, physically, mentally, and spiritually. It is a personal approach to living as opposed to a position that demands political change. It is not goal-oriented, but more a set of ideals according to which one lives. Glikl lived according to the ideal that she was as good as any man. And she was not alone. If you read the book, you see there are other women, perhaps not as active as she, perhaps not as wealthy as she, but in the same direction as she took. So that concludes our 5-lecture series where I attempted to describe the traditional gender boundary and gender hierarchy, and then to discuss the ways in which that boundary was shifted, was permeated, the ways in which the hierarchy was ameliorated. I want to thank, finally, those of you who were here who participated in all the lectures or just this lecture. The most precious gift a person can give you is their time, and I thank you very much for your time.
Magda, thank you, Magda, for your kind introduction, and also thank you, Sarah, and everyone else at Fordham for inviting me and organizing this so flawlessly. It is a great honor to be here, and as Moshe knows, he was very much involved in writing my last book on Chelm, so I really owe him a lot in this work. Today I'm thankful for his illuminating talk on one of the most fascinating pre-modern Jewish women. So Glikl is actually a perfect subject with which to conclude this lecture series, as she moves, as you put it, comfortable as a woman in the early modern society of Ashkenaz, describing not just her own life, but also emphasizing the lives of the women around her, her sisters, stepsister, daughters, daughters-in-law, granddaughters, and many others. And I think the fact that you've highlighted this aspect, in particular, Glikl's phylogeny, is really a valuable perception. True, she has much to say about beloved and well-respected men, such as her father and her husband, but also, as you've shown, she dwells on men who've let her down, who failed in their responsibilities to her and her children. Glikl does not trespass onto what men might have considered their territory, the way that Rivka Tichtina or Leah Horwitz, whom you've discussed last week, maybe do. Yes, she writes a substantial book, but very much for private circulation and not with a view to publication. She doesn't question or attempt to shift the boundaries between men and women, for example, in the liturgical practices or ethos of the synagogue. In this context, she's more interested in recalling unusual events, such as the time when her maid needed to go into the men's section in order to obtain the address of a surgeon and the muttering that is generated. This is the case of a child suspected of having been infected with the plague, another really interesting topic if you're interested in her book, who had this child actually had to stay with Christian peasants outside the town for some time. Anyway, what is atypical about Glikl is that she has access to capital. She is, as some of the scholarship on her has discussed in length, a successful businesswoman And it is true that Robert Lieberlis in a 2004 article has suggested that a certain amount of caution may be appropriate in evaluating such statements of hers. As her husband's, what you've quoted earlier, supposed saying just before his death, and as he said, I'll leave everything to my wife. My wife, she knows everything. She should continue just as she was doing before. Lieberlis construes this as reflecting Glikl's need to reassure her family that the business will be in good hands. If he is disinclined to take her allows too literally, he nevertheless believes that we gain from her a great deal of insight into the emotions of a successful early modern businesswoman who created through marriage and a European network of business alliances. And he praises her especially for the power of her creative writing skills. Last week, Elisheva Baumgarten and you engaged in an exchange about what is most distinctive about the early modern period. And you came down in favor above all of printing, and I very much agree. And this is, of course, is relevant to Glikl's text. Manuscript, though it was and was meant to be. She was definitely a fluent Yiddish reader and writer, possibly a reader of Hebrew and maybe German too, though it is not clear if she was able to read much other than Hebrew script. But literacy aside, there was always the cultural capital of oral transmission. Texts read aloud and stories told from memory clearly inform her manuscript. Her text, as I believe, is a great source for this kind of material as well. Before I come to my questions, let me just say a word about these creative writing skills. Glikl's text features by Chava Toniansky's counting 17 stories, some of them just one page, others running several pages. Simon Davies and Edelson Schein, among others, have tried to make something out of connecting them to other literary texts of the early modern period, whereas earlier scholars such as Alfred Falchenfeld in his German translation chose rather to omit most of Glikl's stories and spiritual reflections, opting to move a selection of them into an appendix. But the stories are essential for understanding Glikl's text. They illustrate not just her take on human nature, as you've pointed it out, but also they show how she envisions a feminine ideal, or at least a Jewish feminine ideal. We can't look at these stories in any detail now. This would probably take another hour or so. But just to refer to one, and not only just one part of it, there's this long story of the Talmid Chacham, pious wife, who is abducted by a sea captain who explains his enthusiasm for the concept of polygamy. He, for example, as he explains, has two wives. One stays home with the 3 children, she's the homemaker, and the other wife is extremely delicate and unfit for housework, but she's very clever. That's why he always takes her along with him to manage the ship. She collects the money, enters the transactions, and supervises all his affairs. And he says he has never lain with her. Glikl's ideal, of course, fulfills both these roles. And also, of course, this is the portrait she likes to portrait of herself. So now let me come to my questions. Glikl's book is unwieldy, a manuscript in a time of book printing. Glikl has, as Chava Toniansky points out, no word for her text. She calls it sometimes a this or a das. There are many different kinds of narrative we find in Glikl's text, and you've mentioned some: a personal memoir, a family history, an account of her business transactions, a historical chronicle in some way, a pinkes of a kind, a Meisebuch, a book of stories, a memorial book for her dead first husband. How would you categorize the text? And what kind of uses do you see, you as a historian, for the use of it? And of course, I would also be interested in how you see this as a use for literary historians. Now I come to your second point, which, something you call the narrative of prescription and the narrative of experience. And I want to come back to your title. So you add the question mark after the phrase traditional Jewish grandmother. So is this because of the current connotations of the term makes it use something of an anachronism in the early modern period. Also, what I find puzzling is the nature of the relationship she describes with her children and grandchildren. She shows great interest in their prospects on the marriage market, but sometimes doesn't say much more. Is there a continuous ideal of a Jewish grandmother, mother? And if so, when does it start and does she confirm to it? And last but not least, last week you said you wished there was a Polish Glikl. I wonder if you want to expand on that and say something about what similarities or dissimilarities between her account and that of an imaginary Polish Jewish woman of her time and class there might be reason to expect in such a discovery, which I still hope we will have.
Okay, well, thank you, Ruth. Let me start with the last point, which connects with something you said in the beginning. Polish Glikl, and Glikl is writing a manuscript in the time of printing. So Rachel Greenblatt pointed out to me that Glikl probably expected people beyond her family to read her book. When she talks about her friend Pesela, she mentions that Pesela wrote an ethical will, and it must be with her children. I'm sure they'll let you read it, which means that her book, which she says she's writing for her children, she assumed that other people might well ask her children for permission to read it. So her audience is not just her family. That's number one. Number two, yes, I agree. You have to take a lot of what she says with a grain of salt. You have to read it critically. But that doesn't matter. What I'm talking about is how she thought of herself. She's telling us how she thinks of herself. Whether indeed Chaim didn't make a move without her, we don't know. But that's not the point. The point is that she's telling us that she told Chaim what to do. What genre? To me, this is a combination of an ethical will and an autobiography or memoir. All these other things that you said seem to be very partial descriptions, talking about a part of the book and not the whole book. How can it be used? So I once wrote that there's no such thing as a reliable source. To ask, is the source reliable, is the wrong question. The question to ask is, how can this source be used? And that depends on the questions we ask the source, the questions we come to the source with. So this is a great source for 17th and 18th century Jewish social history, depending on the kinds of questions we ask, but I can't go into that now. Now, Glikl and her children. This is a very, I would say, edgy topic. On the one hand, she's totally devoted to her children, especially to making matches for them. When Chaim died, only 4 out of the 12 living children were married. She had to find matches for 8 of them, and she's clearly obsessed with it. It reminds me of how my friends in America are obsessed with their children getting into college. So for Glikl, it's finding that match for each one. That's her responsibility. On the other hand, in several places in the book, he shows resentment of her children. She says, well, in a perfect world, you raise your children, you get them matched, and then that's it. They go on their own, and you shouldn't have to be responsible anymore. But what can you do? If they go broke, you've got to help them. But she's clearly not happy about it. And when her son Lev goes broke, she is not very sympathetic. He really resents that she has to spend so much money to bail him out. And she makes various other comments showing that, I mean, there's the famous story about the bird. Quickly, this father bird, it's interesting, she says it's the father, not the mother. Father bird has to fly his nestlings to safety from a storm. And when he takes each one to the middle of this chasm and says, tell me, when I'm old and weak, are you going to take care of me? Like I'm taking care of you? And the first two, they promise him the world, yes, we'll take care of you. And he says to each of them, you're a liar, and he throws them into the chasm. Third one says, I don't know if I'll take care of you. I can only promise you that I'll take care of my children the way you take care of me. And he says, okay, I'll save your life. And I think that's Glikl talking. That's Glikl talking. Although, ironically enough, after Hertz Levy went bankrupt, she had to live with her daughter and son-in-law, which to her was the greatest shame. And she felt it was a failure at the end of her life. I take your point that she does not invade the male space. She goes to synagogue at least once a day, but she has no public role there. She has no political role in the community that she talks about. She has no political influence. The men on the communal council, the men in the synagogue, that's their turf, and she leaves it alone. The turf she shares with the men is the market. And we talked about that in the third lecture. I just want to say a word about the translations. So the scholar David Kaufman published Glikl's book, memoir, whatever we're calling it, in 1896 from her son's manuscript. Then in the early 20th century, it was translated by Bertha Pappenheim and by Falkenfeld, is that his name? Falkenfeld was a pretty good German translation, although he did leave out parts. It was somewhat abridged, but importantly annotated, and his notes are used until today. After that, with one exception, all of the translations were translations of translations. They were translations of the German of Falkenfeld's book, and they played games with it in French, in Italian, in English. The most widely used English translation is by Martin Lowenthal. It appears on dozens, if not hundreds, of college reading lists, and it's terrible. It's terrible. It's a translation into English from the German translation, and it leaves out many things. It's terribly abridged, and it's not accurate. There is a pretty good English translation by Beth Zion Abrahams, which was made from the original manuscript. But until Prava Turniansky came out with her dual language critical edition, we were really in a fog with Glikl scholarship. And what she has done has made it, has opened it up with people realizing this well-known book is we really don't know it very well at all.
So we'll now segue to a couple of questions. We don't have much time, so I will just combine them. There are several questions related to widowhood and I guess the role, the status of widows, and also why women may not want to remarry after becoming widows. And yeah, so I'll leave it like that, and then I'll ask one more question, and then we'll.
Well, from Glikl, it seems pretty clear that the only reason to remarry is to better yourself materially. Marriage is a business deal. Certainly, the second marriage is a business deal. And I'm not sure what was in it for Hertz Levy, but she is very candid that she is marrying him for his money, and evidently that was totally acceptable. She also tells other people she's marrying him for his money. So, as I said before, for many women, the idea that they do not have to be dependent on a man, they are their own master, is a liberating feeling.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a key, because it also had legal ramifications. Being a
Yes.
widow had a different legal status.
Yes, I mean, we see from tax records that widows are the heads of the household, often with a young couple living with them, a young married couple that they are responsible for. And the widow is the head of household, although again, they never get involved, at least in a formal way, in politics. They never hold an office.
And speaking of office, there is a question about Glikl's husband. What do you make out of the point that he never aimed for public office, according to Glikl's list of husband's great features?
Well, she says, I didn't quote the whole passage. She says that many people did strive for public office, and he like made fun of them. She doesn't use those words. I forget what she says, but he thought that was silly to strive for public office. I think that for Glikl and Chaim, the center of life was business. She crosses borders. She gets on a coach, to go to Amsterdam or Cleve or wherever it might be, like we used to go on an airplane. Their life is business, and you don't even feel that they're crossing borders. Politics are meaningless. She doesn't say, oh, now I'm in Holland or now I'm in Denmark. She just crosses the border. It doesn't matter. She lives in a country called Ashkenaz. So I think that she would feel politics is a waste of time.
And we'll close with the final question. I think both of you could address who discovered her, who made her famous, what's the sort of story of her becoming on the syllabi of college courses.
Ruth, do you want to?
I think I think in my field, in our early modern German literature, it was Natalie Seaman Davis who put her on the her publication, put her on the syllabi. But I think she was famous before.
Yes, when I was a student, she was already famous before Natalie Davis touched her.
Right.
Because there's this tremendous thirst for source material. And this is so dramatic and colorful and alive. It's just a natural. And then, of course, she's a woman, which makes it even more attractive.
But even before that, who discovered her manuscript?
David Kaufman.
Okay. In the 19th century.
Late 19th century. Yes.
Okay. So we'll all now go and read Hava Czerniawski's translation. So thank you both. And I invite all of you who are still tuned in to join us for other events. We're not done. We're done just with this series. We're not done with our public events. We have 2 more this week, and everything is packed before Thanksgiving. And then we'll be coming back online after Thanksgiving. We have a film screening of an Israeli documentary about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You have to sign up for it. It's not publicly. We have exclusive right to screen it. And that's tomorrow. And then on Sunday is a book launch for one of our colleagues' books, Nina Rowe, in conversation with Ephraim Shoham Steiner from Ben Gurion University about medieval chronicles, illustrated chronicles of the world. And after Thanksgiving, we have another book launch, a book that just came out yesterday, arrived in my hands, of Sarit Katan's Gribet's fantastic book on time and difference in rabbinic literature. And there's much more this semester and coming up, so please sign up. And thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Moshe. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, all of you.